Good afternoon. I'm Megan Lawless, the Director of Clinical Experiences and Partnerships for the School of Education at MSU Denver. And on behalf of myself and Anna Joseph, who is our Director of Trauma-Informed Practices here in the School of Ed, I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on Trauma-Informed Practices, Building Resilience for Fall 2020. Understanding how trauma impacts the lives of our students has always been very important for us as educators, but of course, during this particularly challenging time, that's never been more true. So I'm truly grateful for the important partnership that we have with our colleagues at Resilient Futures. Before we get started, just a quick moment and note about today's session. It is a Microsoft Teams live meeting, which means that for attendees and participants, your microphones and your cameras are off during the presentation. And so please do use the live event Q&A that's over on your right sidebar to ask questions. We will either answer them in the moment if they're relevant to that particular topic, or we will hold on to them for the Q&A session at the end. But please do know that your questions are of key importance to us as we go through our time today. So without further ado, it is my privilege to welcome one of the co-founders of Resilient Futures, Dr. Megan Brennan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. We really appreciate you spending time thinking about the fall with us. I do also have a co-facilitator who will introduce herself in a few minutes, Whitney Lowry. She is a middle school teacher at Prairie Elementary School and has co-facilitated with me a bunch in the past. So if you've come to some of our previous trainings, there's a good chance that you might have already met her as well. And as Megan said, I'm one of the co-founders of Resilient Futures. We're a nonprofit that works with schools and youth serving agencies across the state of Colorado to help integrate trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. So just a few norms. I know that we're not able to do participation visually through the video, but we are going to do the Q&A. But we'll just really ask that everyone tries to be present with us throughout this time that we're together. As we're asking questions, being mindful of the impact of our words and our stories might have on others, and really taking care of ourselves during this time together. It is a short time together that we are here today, but just always want to give that reminder that if you need to, please stand up and take a break, get some water, fidget or color, do whatever you need to take care of yourself. Next slide, please. So on our agenda today, we're going to start with talking about the stress response through the lens of COVID-19, do a little review and ground ourselves in the 3 C's of resilience, dig into some considerations and strategies for when we're returning to school, and then talk about healing the stress response. Next slide, please. So in many of our trainings, when we start talking about stress and the stress response, I often ask if anybody in the room has experienced stress themselves or is experiencing stress. And what we know about COVID-19 and our stress response is that for many, if not all of us, it's put us into a stress response. That stress response can include things like panic, diminished executive functioning, difficulty following instructions and paying attention. And we do know too that grief and loss reactions can heighten the stress response. It might even impact our ability to take in new information. And we're all going to have a range of responses. Some of us are responding with great amount of fear, some are having a reasonable amount of fears, and other people are extremely fearful during this time. Things like losing a job and closing schools and going into remote learning and the illness or death of a loved one, or even just the possibility of that, are incredibly stressful events individually. But when they're also occurring in this context of this global medical and racial pandemic, the experiences of stress and anxiety might become overwhelming. The other piece that's really important to acknowledge the lens of it is that we've been asked to engage in social distancing. And what we really prefer the term to use is physical distancing. We want to stay connected to the people that we love while also keeping all of us safe by our physical distancing. But what this means is that, the communities that have our really important relationships in our lives, adults in the classroom, or being on athletic teams with coaches, or being in churches with our friends, with our extended family, that all of those have been disrupted. And those are the very connections that we need to continue in order to feel safe and to help cope with the stress that we're experiencing from COVID-19. In addition to COVID-19, we also want to acknowledge the racial pandemic that has been really become more elevated the past few months. This pandemic has always been there, but it has become more elevated in the media and with protests. And so it's important to recognize that students and staff, adult staff, will potentially be experiencing and having responses to both of these events. So, the last thing too, when we're under that stress response and experiencing additional traumas, it might also re-trigger previous traumas. And sometimes we might not know that that previous traumatic experience is being re-triggered, or might not even be aware of that information, that it could potentially trigger previous traumas. So always keeping that in the back of our mind too, as we're using that mindset of, what's happened instead of what's wrong with somebody. Next slide, please. So in previous trainings, we have talked about next slide, please. Oh, thanks. The window of affective tolerance. And we wanted to come back to that as a reminder right now in this pandemic about the window, because for many of us, our window might be a little bit smaller than it used to be. I know for myself in this pandemic, when it first started and we moved to remote learning, I have young kids. I have two boys that were in 2nd and 4th grade. And so there was just a lot to negotiate and figure out. And I was definitely in my stress response and had a very narrow window of tolerance. And so I had found in those first few weeks of that transition that it was really hard for me to sit down and really focus on something that I was doing at work, that I was really easily distracted. My days seemed to fly by and I couldn't really figure out any routine, any kind of pattern to my day. And so one morning when I was having coffee, I just recognized how that simple act of drinking coffee in the morning was really familiar and really grounding for me. And through that act, I was able then to really think about, what other things are familiar to me, even though this whole experience in itself is unfamiliar. What are the day-to-day small little choices and things that I can engage in to bring some of that predictability back into my day? And that was really helpful. And so as all of us are having these different responses to everything that's going on around us, what can happen is we can be at that top part in hyperarousal, engaged in our fight-flight response. It can look like hypervigilance or, big behaviors, big emotional outbursts. And it can also look like on the opposite, that hypoarousal. So, feeling shut down or tuned out, feeling numb, or not even being able to engage in our own self-care. And where we really are hoping to be is in that middle. And we know that when adolescents have persistently high levels of stress and that they don't have the opportunity to have some of that stress buffered by the presence of a trusted and calm adult, that it can go into that toxic stress, and their fight, flight, or freeze system, their stress response, can be engaged more frequently and with greater intensity as well. When I think about this, the window of effective tolerance too, I think about my 2nd grader. When we went into remote learning at first, he seemed to be great and really engaging well with all the content and, really excited to continue doing school. But then his window of tolerance really shrunk too. And I would have expected him to go into that hyperarousal. He's a kid that sometimes has really big emotions. But during this experience, he really went into that hypoarousal. He really kind of shut down and was difficult to motivate him to do much of anything. And so being aware that even though we have stress responses that we often engage in, that for many of us, those stress responses have looked really different during these times. for ourselves and being aware of that for others as well. I think, yeah. Next slide, please.
Hi, my name is Whitney Lowry, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. One of the tools that I wanted to share with you that's been really helpful for me as I navigated the last quarter of the previous year in a remote instructional setting, and as I'm preparing to go back to a lot of unknowns at my school and classroom in just a few weeks here, is this chart that helps us to really think about what we can control and influence and what we can't. And really putting some focus for me in the areas that I can control and influence have helped me to stay in my own window of tolerance more often and to get back there when I find myself falling into that hyper or hypoarousal zone. So when we look at this diagram, on the outside in purple is everything that we can't control or influence. And right now there's so many things that we can't control and influence. You know, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and none of us can control that. And that can be a really overwhelming and scary feeling. But one of the ways that I've found myself able to cope with those feelings of overwhelm is to think about what I can influence and what I can control, and then really put my energy and my thinking into those areas. Next slide, please. So 3 of those areas that we can absolutely control and influence are the 3 C's of resilience that we talk about in a lot of our trainings. So when we talk about resilience, we define it as the capacity to grow and thrive with strength and tenacity in the face of trauma and oppression for individuals and communities. And the 3 C's are a really great anchor we can come back to help us kind of deal with those feelings of overwhelm and think about what areas we can control and we can influence. So we can think about connection. We can think about how we are connecting with every student every single day, whether that connection is happening in person or remotely, because I think that's up in the air for a lot of us as we go into the next school year. There are some things that we can do really easily, like the 2x10 strategy, where you just spend 2 minutes a day talking to a kid for 10 days in a row, and you don't talk about academics, you just check in. And that kind of strategy can really help to build a sense of connection between a teacher or a teacher candidate and a student. We can also help facilitate safe ways for our students to connect with each other. One of the things that I had a lot of success with last quarter in the remote setting was an app called Flipgrid that allowed kids to film short little videos of themselves responding to a prompt and then respond to each other's videos. And it was a way that I could really monitor those interactions, but also that kids could feel connected to each other and to me and to school. The next C is coping. And coping skills and strategies are so important for our own well-being, and we can definitely use our coping skills and strategies as a tool for modeling and teaching those strategies to our students. You know, our kids are feeling all the same big feelings that we're feeling, right? That anxiety and stress is true for students and for their teachers, their educators. And as we model and explicitly talk about how we are coping, we can help students to try and learn new coping skills. The third C is competence. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk in the media recently about how much kids missed out on fourth quarter of last year. And certainly that's true. You know, kids did not necessarily get the best learning opportunities, but hearing a bunch of adults talk about all the things they don't know and missed and how they aren't ready could cause some children to feel like they're behind in their learning, and that could really result in some feelings of anxiety for kids. So recognizing that that's a message students may be hearing and then helping to really increase sense of competence in our students is another thing we absolutely can control and influence. Next slide, please. Another tool that we can use is helping kids to express their experiences through storytelling. So we've been doing some looking at the research that came out after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the really striking things is that teachers who made space for storytelling about the experiences that their students had much better outcomes. They were able to spend more time on actual learning. They were able to get to learning faster with fewer behaviors and issues. And so we really think that this kind of this kind of situation is similar, and it applies here too. And that giving students a chance to share their stories, to be seen and heard, will really, really help them to feel psychologically safe and to feel like they are seen and that they matter. And that in turn will help us get to the learning that we need to have happen. You know, kids are going to have all sorts of different stories coming out of these past several months. There may be kids who are dealing with grief due to the loss of a loved one or anxiety about health of themselves and their family members. There may be job loss, food and housing insecurity, and then of course a sense of disconnection and isolation from all the time that we've had to spend at home. And it's really important that we don't assume anything about what experiences our students may have had. There's a wide range of things that have happened to all of us. And our job is just to be there to listen to what did happen to our students and not necessarily to fix it. We can't control what already happened, right? That's not in our sphere of influence, but we absolutely can use our influence to listen and to validate. And that's an incredibly valuable and powerful tool that we encourage you to consider using with your students. Next slide, please. So as we are talking about storytelling, ours and our students, and really we should also be telling our own stories, right, modeling that, we need to make sure that we're being cognizant about the power of the language that we are choosing. So this is always important as a teacher, and it's, I think, increasingly important as we move into this next school year, whether it is online or it is in person. So we need to really think about how we are talking about situations and kids and other staff members and thinking about the words that we're choosing. So if you are talking to a colleague about the school year, the upcoming year, and you're saying things like, oh, this year's going to be a disaster, it's going to be a nightmare, right? Those words have some pretty significant negative connotations, and those can really color the entire tone of the conversation. Whereas if we're shifting that language to this year could be really challenging, right? This year is going to really encourage us to have to try some new things and to learn and to grow. That kind of language is more likely to, help us to frame things in a more asset-focused manner. The same thing is true as we talk about kids. Sometimes people will refer to their students as like little monsters or, things like that. And those connotations there are really telling, right? It shows some attitudes and some thinking. And as we shift those and we remember that the kids are people and they have lived experiences, that can really, really help. And it can help things to feel safer for the kids and for us as adults. There's nothing more toxic than being in a staff room with a bunch of people who are complaining and being incredibly negative. I've certainly been there. And it can be really hard to be the positive person who's like, well, it's not going to be a nightmare. It's just going to be a challenge. But it's worth it. And the time that we spend to really reframe that experience impacts us and it impacts our colleagues. The more that I talk in positive terms and that I talk to positive colleagues, the more positive I'm able to feel about my job and about my ability to have a positive impact this coming school year. Next slide, please. One of the realities that most, if not all of us, are going back to is that we are going to be teaching school while wearing masks and to a room full of kids who are also wearing masks. And that is, of course, if we're back in person. If we're online, not so much. And that really throws a wrench into some things, right? We rely so much on nonverbal communication to help our message land the way we intend it to. Kids can't see that you say something with a smile on your face. They have no idea. You might be scowling for all they know, right? So it's going to be really important for us to do some things that may feel a little silly right now, but to say, I am smiling right now. I'm so happy you're here today. I'm smiling at you, because they don't know. And without that information, it can be really scary for kids because they don't have a feel for what kind of a teacher they're looking at, what kind of a mood you're in, what their level of safety in the space is based on the adult experience that's happening. So naming how we're feeling can be really powerful as we learn to teach with masks on. I think it's also going to be really important to, as much as possible, not rely on sarcasm. And I know we talk a lot about how sarcasm can, even when super well-intentioned, be a really damaging thing in a secondary classroom under the best of circumstances. But now with the lack of verbal or the nonverbal cues, the facial expressions, the smiles, things like that, sarcasm may not land like sarcasm. It may just land mean, And that is not something that we want kids to be feeling and experiencing in any of our classrooms, I'm certain. So really watching the sarcasm is something I'm planning to do next year. I'm also an ELA teacher. I work with kids who are speaking English as a second language. And so I've been thinking a lot about how mask wearing is going to impact those students I work directly with. You know, starting with my newcomers who have very limited English and rely heavily on nonverbals. You know, my teacher's happy, she's smiling. My teacher's not so happy, she's frowning, right? Those kids are going to lose that clue. And so I need to figure out other ways to help them understand how I'm doing, and possibly ways without language. So I'm thinking maybe a year of a lot of like thumbs up, thumbs down. We're like, you know, a lot of gesturing. Even for our kids who have a little bit more proficiency in English, a lot of our kids look at our mouths to watch us make shapes so that they can better understand what sounds we're producing. And that's especially true for kids who are learning English as a second language. So it's going to be incredibly important to speak slowly and loudly, to repeat things often, when possible, to provide things in writing on the board or screen on their paper, in addition to saying them out loud. And all of those instructional choices can really help create a trauma-informed space because you're lowering that affective filter. Kids are feeling less threatened and less scared because they know what you want from them. They understand what you're saying, even if they can't see your mouth as they're used to having. Another thing that I have been thinking a lot about in my own practice is losing the ability to have proximity to my students. You know, I'm sure you've heard all about it in your teacher prep programs. You know, proximity is a great classroom management tool, but beyond that, it's also a great connection tool. And it's something where, you know, I've used for years as a way to connect with my students, standing near someone in the hallway, or a little side hug, or a high five. All of those gestures that involve proximity are ways that I built connection and that I built relationships with my students. And I don't have that anymore. So I have to think really intentionally and in advance about what I could do without proximity to help my students feel loved and feel seen and heard and valued. And those are really, you know, going to look different next year. I think I'm going to have to spend a lot more time talking. You know, a lot more things have to be said explicitly. I can't just be like, high five, great job. I have to really be like, I love how you did, you know, whatever it is you did. And I think it'll work. But what I'm really realizing for myself is that so much intentional thinking is going to have to take place in advance, because a lot of the skills and strategies that I've relied on and that I think we teach you aren't going to be as available as we would like for them to be. Next slide, please.
So thinking through and back to that lens of cultural humility too, which is part of creating that trauma-informed space that Whitney was talking about. And actually, first, before I dive into cultural humility, I'd forgotten that I wanted to say something too about our window of tolerances. That, you know, when you're working too with your mentor teacher in classrooms, really considering too that not only are our window of tolerances might be a little thinner, same with mentor teachers too. And so having that grace with your mentor teacher too, and thinking about, you know, what's happening for them as well as we move through this process and through all the unknowns.
Megan, can I jump in really fast on that?
Please.
Sorry to interrupt. So I spend a lot of time co-teaching as an ELA specialist. So often I'm the second adult in a classroom. And one of the things that I've found historically to be really helpful, and that I'm excited to continue doing next year, is to really have explicit conversations with my collaborating teachers about what we can do when one of us is struggling, when one of us needs some regulatory support, right? I have a colleague that I taught with last year who we had a sign that he would do when he needed me to come over and give him a break, or when there was a situation and he would appreciate my intervention. Because I didn't want to obviously step on his toes or anything, but coming up in advance with a way for us to acknowledge, like, okay, feeling less regulated than I'd like to right now. And having that second adult as a resource can be really valuable. And especially when in advance you've talked about when to jump in, how jumping in could look. And then that co-regulation piece can be great to model for the kids, but also just to keep the classroom as a really positive and safe space.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that, Whitney. You know, and I think a word that continues to be used, and you'll continue to hear us use throughout this, is that idea of things being really intentional having those intentional conversations with your mentor teacher, thinking intentionally about how we're going to communicate nonverbal skills with masks on. And so kind of an overarching theme in thinking about cultural humility as well. We learned about this lens of cultural humility as a main tenet of the trauma-informed work, and really thinking about it to create those spaces and experiences for our students and families of color that are acknowledged, validated, and supported. Often when we work in schools or with kids in any capacity, we want to really quickly understand how things are and then try and fix them. But the work of cultural humility and equity isn't about a quick fix. It's not a box to complete. It's not about fixing the students that we work with or even our colleagues. Like any aspect of the trauma-informed work, it's really a shift in mindset. And that initially really begins with ourselves as one of those 3 tenets that we talked about with cultural humility talks about. It's that critical reflection and lifelong learning. And so the difficult work of cultural humility and equity really involves that process of recognizing first and identifying the messages about race that we've taken in, that are part of who we are and that we use, and then how we are communicating, those beliefs, those experiences out. We're being asked in so many of the spaces that we work in with youth and adults, how to have race-based conversations, how to bring the experiences that have happened through protests and through the murders of so many individuals into the classroom. And one of the first ways that we talk about is really increasing our own knowledge and understanding of the ways in which experiences of racial trauma show up for ourselves first, and then show up in the classrooms and in the school communities. This could be a training that goes on for years, because we know that the process and journey through cultural humility is a lifelong journey. And so we wanted to provide some resources to be able to tap into, outside of this training, to really dive into what are our own needs around this, and how comfortable are we having these kinds of conversations? What other skills or supports might we need? And we really find the Teaching Tolerance website to be helpful. They have so many great resources that you can filter by the grade that you teach, by other filters, pretty much anything that by topic, if you're having race-based conversations, if you're having conversations around LGBTQ issues, there's so many resources, but there's one in particular that we have found also to be really helpful, as it involves that that self-reflection, and it's called Let's Talk, and we'll send out the link for this resource. But it's just provides opportunities to really have that self-reflection of what I'm comfortable with, what other resources I need, and what other skill development do I need in order to be able to have conversations in the classroom. Because adolescents, much more than younger children, will be more aware of what's been going on through social media, through their friends, through watching television, and so being able to bring their whole selves into the classroom and be able to have conversations about all the things that are going on is really important. And when we don't talk about them too, and we're not willing to bring them into the classroom, that's a form of communication that's really important too, and that silence is really important. To not be silent, to be able to, in a developmentally appropriate way, really be able to engage students. Next slide, please. So another piece that we really thought was important to touch on today was understanding grief and the process of grief. Grief is really normal, and the process of grief is really healthy, but grief can be really hard, and it's really unpredictable. Grief is this experience. It's a psychological and emotional experience following any kind of loss. It can be a loss of, such as a death of a loved one, but it can also be the loss of housing that many of our students are experiencing, or food insecurity, or, the loss of parents' jobs. It could be thinking about a lot of the losses that so many students had at the end of last school year, about not getting to attend graduation in the way that they thought, or transition to have an ending in elementary school before they transition to middle school. And so really being aware and thoughtful of just how the experiences of grief that so many, if not all of us, are experiencing, really are very important. And they too can also start that stress response system that we've been talking about, and can also heighten that stress response system. Next slide, please. And so grief shows up in a lot of different ways for all of us. It can show up in a physical manner. It can show up in an emotional way, behaviorally or cognitively. And so thinking about, in the classroom, what might that look like for a student? It might be one of these things, or it might be all four of these areas that we're seeing in a student. They might come in appearing really tired too, from the physical symptoms of being, then the emotional side of it, those feelings of feeling helpless and afraid, and so they're not able to sleep at night. Their behavior might change. Oftentimes we tend to think about grief really in terms of sadness and in terms of crying, but that might not be how the student is experiencing it. It might be more of a withdrawing, or on the complete opposite side, that hyperarousal side of having really big emotions and maybe expressing them with really big behaviors. We can see it, in changes with substance use of, possibly a student that wasn't using substances before and really engaging in substance use to numb out all of those feelings. Cognitively, it can be an inability to concentrate. Sometimes even difficulty with memory too, because it's, time is really hard to judge sometimes when we're in that grief process, and difficulties with sustained attention because, their mind keeps returning to the grief that occurred. And so, again, not assuming any of the experiences that our students may be coming in with, but recognizing that grief might be showing up for all of us and in these very different ways. Next slide, please. And so often grief has been talked about in these stages, and I like this timeline and this visual representation because it shows 3 different stages, but in terms of that first stage about the ending of something, that next stage about the transition, and the third stage about new beginnings. And as I said, grief is not predictable, it's really unpredictable. And so, we might be starting out into a transition phase and then jump back into that resistance or anger phase. And so it's not linear, it's not straightforward. And eventually we may get to stage 3 of new beginnings, but there is this whole process along the way that can be helpful in recognizing, that it's okay to also be able, to know, and for ourselves too, that we might have felt like we're progressing, and then we might be, back where we first started. And all of that is really normal in the grief process and okay. Next slide, please. So these 6 areas are areas that can really help to heal the stress response system: nutrition, exercise, sleep, mindfulness, mental health. And when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about engaging in more intensive support around mental health. So maybe it's, doing some kind of group work, going to therapy, other things that are really focused on mental health. And last, one that we always come back to is healthy relationships. And so taking a few minutes thinking about, for your own stress response, for modulating yourself, what are the top 3 ways or things that you engage in when you notice your own stress response is really being heightened? For me, my top 3 are really sleep, exercise, and healthy relationships. And when we identify our top 3, often we recognize that when we're helping somebody else potentially with healing their own stress response and regulating their own stress response, we often offer strategies in the top 3 areas that we use, and and can sometimes forget that maybe this person, their top 3 go-to strategies that they need or go-to areas might be different from ours. And recognizing that, for ourselves as individuals, all of these are in our own locus of control, as Whitney talked about, but may not be in our locus of control for our students. So Whitney, do you want to talk about what your top 3 are?
Yeah, my top 3 are definitely sleep, mindfulness, and healthy relationships. So knowing that about myself shows that I kind of like things to be a little calmer and more chilled out, and that's what feels really good to me. But I teach middle schoolers, and sometimes what they need is movement, exercise, and relationships, but in a really different, much more like, boisterous way. And so I have to really, in a classroom setting, think about how I can meet my own needs, because taking care of myself really matters so that I can show up for my students the best way possible, but also making sure that I'm giving them opportunities to take care of their needs. And so when we think about these 6 things in the context of a secondary classroom setting, there are a lot of things that we can do, and some things that are outside our control. Nutrition is one where we can talk the talk, right? But it's really hard to control whether the kids are eating only hot Cheetos or not, right? If they do, they do. But we can do things like encourage kids to get drinks of water, things that'll really help their nutrition and their overall well-being. Exercise and movement in the classroom has always been a strategy that I think is really important. It gets a bit more tricky when we're trying to keep things socially distant and we want to not be all touching the same ball that we're throwing around with a game or what have you. But my co-teachers and I have been doing some really intentional planning about how we can make sure to include movement in our classroom. And for us, that's going to look like doing some structures where kids have seat numbers so that we can control how many kids are up and moving at a time, and making sure that the movement is something that we've talked about and practiced so that the kids know exactly what we're kind of up to and why. But even if it's something as simple as everybody in a seat number 1, stand up and stretch tall. All right, they sit down. All right, everybody in a seat number 2, just so that we're getting movement in, but we're doing it in a way that's safe given the current limitations that we're working with. Sleep with adolescents is always a little bit tricky. They need a lot of it. Ideally, they need it in the early morning, when we sometimes make them come to school. So, we can encourage kids to get rest. That's something that I can't control though, right? And that's okay. And that's okay for me to just let it go sometimes when I know I can't control it. Mindfulness in the classroom is something that we've been advocating for a long time, as simple as taking some deep breaths or working through a mindfulness activity, maybe doing, some kind of Go Noodle type of app, depending on your kids and their maturity and age. And also modeling that, I think, is something that's really powerful. Megan, do you want to talk about the last 2?
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of mental health too, thinking for our students, when we need to refer them to our school social worker or school psychologist, and what that process is, so that that person can really help the student get connected to the services that they need. Many of the students that we're working with, the adolescents, might have had some really difficult experiences over the last few months. And so recognizing that it's not on us to always be the one that's engaging and helping that student, that there's other resources for more intensive needs. And then also for ourselves, as students at MSU, if things are feeling really overwhelming, reaching out and calling the MSU counseling service. Getting your own needs met too is equally as important as getting the needs met of our students. And last, with healthy relationships, something that we always go back to, in that stress response, we know that in our bodies and in our brains, a lot of different chemicals, including our cortisol, are released. And so when we're in healthy relationships and we have that experience of being connected to somebody, a different chemical, a different hormone is released called I just totally lost my train of thought, oxytocin. And what it does is it helps to mitigate that stress response. It helps to heal that cortisol response and provides us those feelings of really trust and connection that are so important. And so every time we can have one of those moments to engage with a student in a healthy relationship, a strategy like Whitney was talking about, that we're not focusing on academics, we're just really getting to know a student for a few minutes, really helps to heal that stress response for ourselves, because that same it's the oxytocin's released in ourselves too, as we're creating that relationship with the student and in the student. So it works both ways. And having healthy relationships for us as adults too, outside of just our professional. So continuing to connect with people that are important to us in whatever capacity helps for our own healing of our own stress response. I think one thing that from these 6 different areas too that has kind of come up that we haven't explicitly talked about is just as we'll be renorming school all year for all of these students and for ourselves too. There'll be so much flexibility and unpredictability needed, or flexibility needed for the unpredictability that we're going to be experiencing. And so thinking that if we're in this stress response and our learning brain isn't as accessible, what do we need to help students be able to understand and renorm? And one of the things Whitney said that reminded me of this is that practice of what the exercise would and movement would look like in the classroom, and reminders. And so reminders for students too, knowing that their capacity for taking in new information or remembering it too might be more limited. And so providing those reminders and renorming considerations continually, and having a lot of grace with ourselves too in that process, because we're renorming school for ourselves as well. Anything else that you want to add, Whitney?
One of the things I've been thinking about as I'm getting ready to go back to school is that I know there's a sense of fear and anxiety for me and for a lot of other educators, and that I'm not necessarily at my best when I'm feeling scared or when I'm feeling like, threatened by a kid not following the mask rule, right? I'm like, oh, I don't want to get sick, and the kid's not doing it. And one of the things I'm having to really think about is how I'm going to make sure that I make those reminders that you were talking about, Megan, in a way that is trauma informed, right? Where I'm taking care of my own need to feel safe and secure at my job, but where I'm also not putting kids in a situation where they feel really afraid of me or afraid of school because my fear is coming out. So, one of the things that I do for a lot of things that I can predict are going to come up and might be a little bit of a challenging situation is I kind of make myself a mental script for what am I going to say when an inevitable thing happens, right? When a kid has their nose sticking out of their mask, right? It's like over just, their mouth. And I'm like, oh, it doesn't even count, right? What do I say? And how do I approach that situation? And doing that thinking in advance is a way that I can feel more in control, and that I can also preserve a sense of safety for myself and for my students.
I think also, if I may, those are both, amazing sets of examples. And I've also heard you say, Dr. Brennan, so much about the role of predictability for our students and for ourselves. And I know you've sort of touched on it, but maybe if one of you could address some ideas around that a little bit as well.
I love predictability, and so does everyone, right? We're humans. Predictability feels really good and really safe. I think that one of the things we can do, either online or in person, depending on how school looks, is build really strong routines and procedures that kids can count on and rely on. And that way they know what's going to happen. And that can be from, things like, how do we sharpen pencils this year? Like, I don't know if we should all be, touching the pencil sharpener. So thinking that through and then teaching it to kids can help with predictability. And the same thing is true around behavior management in my classroom. I try to be really transparent about what happens when different behaviors show up so that kids don't have to wonder, is today a day when she's going to fly off the handle because I talked over her, or not, right? I try to be really consistent in my responses and really transparent in those. That way kids know what they're going to get and they don't have to live in any kind of fear around what's going to happen. Megan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think, as we keep mentioning that the unpredictability of going from remote to in person, back to remote, there's so many unknowns that, helping maybe a mentor teacher think about and create a routine of the class period that's consistent whether you're in person or not in person. So the beginning of the class starts the same way. It can start the same way virtually as it does in person, and hopefully maybe could end on the same note too. And so that predictability of what to expect throughout the class period as well wouldn't change. And that, even though it'll be stressful to have to, go back and forth and be flexible in those situations, that's one way I think that could really help to create that safety through predictability.
Just to connect to that, when we moved online fourth quarter, I teach an 8th grade language arts co-taught class, and we had a pretty consistent beginning of class routine, and we went online, you know, like everybody else did, with very little warning or planning, and we kind of dropped the beginning of class routine because everything was crazy. And we had several kids message us and be like, hey, could we do the warm up? We're like, we thought you kind of hated it, but okay, if you really want to do it, you know, we'll do it. So kids ask for that too, which I think, you know, for every kid that asks, probably 5 or 10 others were really wishing we'd just be consistent. But I think it helps them to feel safe and to feel like they know what's coming.
Should go to the next slide, Whitney. I think that.
All right, so you know, we've talked a lot today about different strategies and practices that you can use when we return to school, whatever the format is, but we're just going to kind of go over 3 major ones. The first is that we change the question. So, you know, we don't ask what's wrong with you. Instead, it's what happened. And also, what's good, what's right? Making sure we're making room for the story of hope, which is what resilience is all about, you know, because things definitely happen and those things need to be acknowledged and processed. But good things happen too, and it's important for us to help kids to stay, and adults to stay in that place of resilience and hope. Another thing that we can do is to remember that behavior has meaning, and it's not a direct commentary on us as educators. They aren't doing it to us. They are using behaviors that were survival skills in a different circumstance. I mean, maybe being on their phone all the time is how they got through 6 months of being stuck at home, and that was a skill that worked really well in that context. It may not work as well in the classroom, and we may have to help adjust that behavior, but recognizing that that behavior was a skill. It may be maladaptive in the new context, but it was intentional and appropriate in a different context. And it's not about us, it's not personal. We also need to work to create a trauma-informed culture, and that's true in our classroom and in our greater institutions. We need to make sure that our spaces are safe and anti-racist, non-judgmental, collaborative, relational, and focused on resilience. And that's a huge job, right? Like, I'm on a big committee at my school around creating a trauma-informed culture, and it's a lot of work. It's ongoing work, but it's really important work, and it's incremental work. Each little step that we take makes a difference for our experience and for our students' experiences.
I think one thing I would add to that Megan reminded us in the last presentation for elementary, that was focused on elementary age, is really about bringing joy to teaching. Is fun, and kids are fun, and you know, the interactions that we get to have with students are really fun. And so bringing that joy back, you know, into that lens back into the work too. And you know, I remember I was leading a like a teacher wellness kind of space for some middle school teachers about probably about 2 or 2.5 months into the pandemic. And one of the teachers told a really funny story about a dream he'd had, and all of us were laughing so hard that we were crying. And it felt so good to laugh and connect in that way around happiness too. And so reminding ourselves that joy is good too, and that you know, it's joyful to be with students. Next slide, please.
All right, so we want to really think about transforming trauma, because it's so important that we understand trauma, and we've done a lot of work around that. But we have to make sure that our system knows that we can create supportive and caring environments that build strength and resiliency, and that everybody in our system can develop and grow and thrive, regardless of what traumas they may have experienced or the pandemics that we're currently living through, and that it's always a story of hope, and that we can figure it out together and we can make it better together. And I think that is maybe the most important message of the work that we do with our students. Next slide, please. So we want to open up the space for some questions. I think we have one in the chat that Megan Lawson's going to read for us in a minute, but we welcome any questions that you have, anything that you're thinking about, anything that we can shed light on. So please feel free to ask.
Awesome. Thanks, Whitney. I think that Keisha's question actually ties in really well with the conversation that you were having there just at the end around building communities. So she asked, what's the best way to develop a community with fellow teachers and administrators that supports trauma-informed practices? So this is a huge, important question, but maybe a few initial ideas on this would be terrific.
One of the things that I think has been really influential in building that kind of a community for myself at Prairie Middle School, where I am happy to work, is that I talk about trauma-informed practices all the time to everybody, whether they're listening about it or not. And I name things as trauma-informed practices when they are. And I think that that has really helped a lot of people that I work with to think about the role of trauma and trauma-informed practices in what we're doing. So I think that that naming can be really powerful. We talk a lot about finding your people who are either doing trauma-informed practices because they've been trained or because it's just intuitive or instinctual for them. But also, you know, I've been thinking more about my responsibility to find people who aren't my people and to really reach out to them and talk about what we know about how trauma impacts young people and how trauma-informed practices can have a positive change in those. Megan, what do you want to add there?
Yeah, I think something that we hear a lot in our trainings, and thanks, Whitney, for what you just said too, is, you know, sometimes it starts really small with just a couple of educators together saying, you know, I heard some information and I've really been thinking about it. And, you know, when you're talking about a student or a situation, thinking like, oh, you know, I learned about this different mindset shift about thinking about, you know, what's happening for the student or what's happened and how can we be responsive to meet the needs of that student, and just starting to use language like that to shift some of those conversations and the mindset. And it is, you know, it's a journey for sure. And in some schools, it starts more formally with trainings and with administration and, you know, getting everyone in the school involved at one time. But that's definitely not the journey of every school and every classroom and every educator. And so just, I think, thinking about too, like Whitney was talking about, those opportunities that are more in your locus of control, that you can provide some of that, you know, reframing or what you've learned into those spaces. Yeah.
I would also say that recommending places for people to learn can be really powerful. Like I've been reading this book, Onward, with a group of other teachers at my school who are all interested in trauma-informed practices. And this book in itself is really wonderful. I highly recommend it. But I think having resources available to share with people who are interested in learning more can be really helpful too.
Other questions? Yeah.
Okay, well, while you guys are thinking of your questions, I'm going to throw out one that's been kind of rattling around in my head. Oh, maybe we got one. Never mind. I'll stop talking. Okay, I see one that says, what are some strategies to... Oh, it moved. Now it's published. What are some I don't know, it went away. There was a... What are some strategies to draw the line between coping skills and class norms? Fidgeting or being on their phones. Okay. Do you want to do that one, Megan, or do you want me to hop in?
You start. How would you differentiate those two?
I would say that flexibility is kind of the name of the game on that one for me. You know, I definitely don't run a classroom where it's totally cool to be on your phone the whole time and completely tuning out to me, or really on your phone at all. So what I tend to do is be like, hey, I see that you're on your phone a lot today. I'm wondering what's going on with you, what's happening? And giving the kid a chance to say, oh, well, you know, my mom lost her job, or, you know, whatever thing is going on that might cause them to need to use that strategy, such as a phone. And then that's a place where I like to talk about other coping mechanisms that we could try instead, that might be a little bit more suited to the current environment. I try to stay really far away from it being punitive, because I think that that rarely has the result I want. Fidgeting is one where I am pretty much like, you do you. If you need to walk back and forth across the back of my classroom and that's how you focus and learn best, that's great. Megan's been in my classroom when kids have been doing that and more, and then have been so engaged in a classroom discussion over the content later, so I know that it's okay and that it's working. Generally, if what they're doing isn't impacting other learners, I tend to be like, that's cool if you're engaged. So for me, the line isn't super firm, which is maybe not a super helpful answer.
You know, one thing I've seen you do, Whitney, in your classes is you co-create those classroom norms at the beginning of the school year with students, so that when things are going on, there can be reminders of what are the classroom norms and everybody's agreed to them. And I've seen in Whitney's class too that it's often the students that are holding each other accountable for those classroom norms. If somebody's fidgeting and it's really disrupting their learning, the student might say, hey, you know, tapping your pencil it's really difficult for me to hear, you know, and they kind of help distinguish between the two as well, because those norms were co-created, and there's that their voices were also in the space of what's important to them to create that safe learning environment from the beginning.
Yeah, I also think that offering alternatives can be really positive and helpful. So saying, you know, I can see that you need some movement, here's a wiggle cushion, or, you know, maybe go get a quick drink of water can be a way to help keep classroom norms happening, but also meet the needs that kids are showing you that they have through those kinds of behaviors. And also being like, you know what, at the beginning of the year, you know, we say straight up, like, if you're having a day and you need to kind of check out today and there's reasons for that and it's not an everyday thing, there's space to talk about that and to make those choices together as a classroom. Any other questions?
Whitney, did you have a question that had been in your mind?
I did, and then it went away. I'm trying to remember what my question was. It felt pressing at the time.
Does it work, Whitney, if I give you a quick moment to think and share a little bit of information with folks about some next steps?
Thank you.
So we did also want to be sure that all of our fabulous teacher candidates know that we are going to be continuing the fantastic workshops with you all with Resilient Futures and Partners this fall, just in that virtual space, so that we can continue our overall work together on trauma-informed practices. So keep an eye out for an email with dates and RSVP links after the school semester begins.
All right, it's gone. I don't know what to tell you. But I did remember when I was trying to think of that I forgot to mention that I think it says Brianna Woods underneath me right now. I'm not Brianna Woods, I'm Whitney Lowry. Sorry about that.
You know, I think one question that's consistently come up for us the last few weeks too is just, you know, there's a lot of anxiety about managing everything that's going to be coming in the classroom, because everybody's going to have their own individual experiences and stories too. And so always going back to, you know, what are ways that we can respond in the best way possible, rather than be reactive and rather than be in our own stress response. And, you know, as Whitney talked about, like, thinking through some of the ways that we might want to respond and practicing it, so that, you know, our bodies and our minds have already had that experience, about really focusing on our own individual wellness too, and our own connections, you know, as part of that. But there is going to be, you know, there is so much unknown right now too. And so creating that daily predictability for yourself too, in your habits and what works for you. If it's, you know, like me, for morning coffee, and then I go on a walk now for a few minutes, and then I come back and start my day before I even look at email, and that involved me getting up a little earlier in order to be able to do that. But providing some of those predictable moments for yourself too can be another really helpful strategy. So thank you so much for being with us today, and for joining us, and for all the work that you're continuing to do for students and for yourself. It's really incredible, and thank you. And thanks to MSU, to Megan and Anna, for having us today and for facilitating this space, providing the opportunity.
And I'd love to just say a final thank you to our fabulous presenters. We really appreciate the additional time with us and your thoughtful insights and examples, and just really want to say thanks for spending time with us today. And to our fantastic students, thank you for spending time with us today, whether you're watching live or later on with the recording, and we look forward to reconnecting again soon. Everybody take good care.
Bye.
Bye.